So I think the Deputy Secretary General has very well set the stage for our next panel, which will look at EU-NATO-US cooperation. As the Deputy Secretary General said, we are now have a broader concept of security. We need to look at issues including resilience, hybrid, 5G, military mobility. So to take us through these issues, we have a really fantastic panel. Representing the NATO perspective, we will have James Appathurai, I hope I pronounced his name correctly, who's Deputy Assistant Secretary General for Political Affairs and also responsible for relations with partners and organisations. Kathleen Hicks of the Centre for Strategic and International Studies, where she's the Director for the International Security Programme, will provide the expert view. Representing the European Union, the Commission, we have Herald Ruijters, who's Director for Investment, Innovative and Sustainable Transport at DG Mobility and Transport. From the US side, we have Michael Ryan, Deputy Assistant Secretary for European and NATO Policy at the Department of Defence, who's currently also performing the duties of Assistant Secretary of Defence, Security and Defence Policy. And to moderate this discussion, a woman who I think needs no introduction will be Fiona Hill, Senior Fellow at the Brookings Institute and former Senior Director for Europe at the NSC, where I have to say she was a very valued interlocutor for us here at the European Union delegation, and I know for the member state embassies also. So with that, Fiona, I hand over to you for a wonderful discussion.
Thank you so much. It's really wonderful to be here with everyone today, and I'd just like to thank the panelists for taking the time to join us. I know everyone has very busy schedules in spite of everything being virtual. In fact, it's probably busier than normal, so really very privileged, all of us, to have you with us today. A number of the issues that we're going to focus on have already been picked up over the last day and in the last session in particular. And I thought that we would start today by talking about one of the critical issues and turn first over to James about the issue of mobility. We've heard a lot about this. It's obviously a pretty critical issue for ensuring the security of allies from the NATO perspective, but it's also an important part of the EU's activities. Obviously, from the EU perspective, mobility has all kinds of different connotations than transporting military personnel and equipment. It's also an important part of the movement of people for commerce and daily business, regular travel, and also an important part of communications and trade. And I know that this is an area where the NATO and EU officials have been very focused. There's some important meetings coming up in the EU context. But perhaps, James, you could give us some insights about how NATO is grappling with that issue right now and some of the things that everyone should be thinking about. And thank you again for joining us today.
It's a real pleasure, Fiona, and great to be here with all these great panelists. Maybe I can just say a few words to introduce. And I think it's useful for people who don't spend all day on military mobility, just to get a little bit of context. A few decades ago, during the Cold War, military mobility was much more straightforward. One reason was that NATO had pretty much responsibility for this. Another reason was governments owned the infrastructure, the railroads or the ports or the airfields, or they could take control of it. Third, because the infrastructure was very strong. It was built to standard. The bridges were strong, could take a tank. The airfields were made for receiving military equipment. And finally, the procedures were in place for NATO to move things around very easily, very quickly. Things have changed a lot since then, since the end of the Cold War, in particular, in a number of ways. One is the European Union now has a very strong role and a regulatory role and responsibility for its member states, but in ways which, of course, affect the way NATO would operate. Second, private companies now control a lot of this infrastructure, and governments don't have the same control that they used to. A third challenge is a lot of the infrastructure, because the Cold War was over for so long, just hasn't been built to the same standards and needs to be brought back up to standard. Finally, we don't have the same procedures we had in place to move dangerous equipment or soldiers across borders very, very quickly. So all of that now needs to be brought back up to standard. And cooperation between NATO and the European Union is crucial because the EU has a lot of powers, regulatory powers in particular, which are crucial for our ability to defend each other. As the Deputy Secretary General just said, 22 members of the European Union are in NATO anyway. But even for the countries that aren't in NATO, but are in the European Union, NATO's ability to do what it needs to do to defend NATO territory has positive effects for everybody else. So it's in everybody's interest that we do this. So what have we done? We've had very, very close cooperation over the past few years, staff to staff, of course, the Secretary General at his level as well, but to, for example, share our military requirements with the European Union as they prepare their EU action plan on military mobility. We have shared with them the specifications, NATO specifications for the movement of dangerous material. We have talked to them about transport infrastructure and what the standards are that we need to be able to move military equipment around. We've talked about customs. That's something, customs movements, that's something the EU has a very important role to play. And when it comes to cross-border movements. In other words, EU governments like NATO governments need to be able to give permission for equipment and personnel to move relatively quickly, in a crisis extremely quickly, but there's legislation in place and we need to kind of work through all of that as well. So these discussions are going on. We're very, very happy that the EU has put a substantial amount of money into its draft budget to make sure that they can fund a lot of this. And actually, this is an area where we feel NATO-EU cooperation is going quite well. Over to you.
Thank you very much, James. Harold, I wonder if you might also comment in response to James about some of the complications that we've seen developing over the last several months in the current pandemic environment. I mean, clearly, a number of EU member countries have imposed some border restrictions, obviously, from the perspective of the United States, a NATO member, but obviously not a member of the EU. We've been watching very closely some of the restrictions on travel that have been imposed because of concerns about the transmission of the virus. But that also raises the point that there is now, as a result of Brexit and the withdrawal of the UK from the EU, increasingly fewer members of NATO that are also members of the European Union. And obviously from the customs point of view and the transportation of various goods, not least the mobility of people, that will introduce some additional complications. And I know that the EU is grappling with these issues right now. You have a big budget meeting coming up that will deal directly with some of the issues that James has highlighted. But perhaps you could give us a little flavour of some of the complexity that you're also dealing with at this moment. Thank you, Harold.
Thank you, Fiona, and thank you for inviting to this event. And delighted also to give a follow-up to what was just said by James as well. The action plan on military mobility, in fact, was launched in March 2018, and it is one of several defense initiatives in the EU. At DG Move, we mainly focus on the development of the legal framework and the development also of new and existing infrastructure. And of course, indeed, the crisis on COVID has shown us the need for that. We had to install very quickly green lanes for the continuity of essential freight and movements in the Union. With the action plan on military mobility and the future funding of civilian military infrastructure dual-use projects through our funding instrument, the Connecting Europe facility, we will have an unprecedented opportunity to increase military mobility. In fact, the action plan addresses the need to meet the need to move military forces, assets and equipment swiftly within and beyond the EU. And the challenge is that there are, of course, still physical, legal, and regulatory barriers that hamper military mobility. For instance, the barriers include infrastructure that does not support the weight of military vehicles, or customs procedures that are cumbersome, or the need to have multiple permissions for military cross-border movements. And these barriers may hinder military mobility and prevent member states from reacting swiftly when there are threats and also effectiveness that is needed. So removing these barriers would be of the essence in the context of NATO, as well as in the common security and defense policy initiatives and activities. So we are, of course, therefore tackling these barriers, and we are focusing on two pillars, on the transport infrastructure and on the regulatory and the procedural issues. On the infrastructure, we of course are looking to building and upgrading transport infrastructure to meet the military needs. And as indicated by James, we have the EU member states defining generic military requirements for transport infrastructure already in November 2018. And also including a geographical military network covering all transport modes. We know, of course, which roads, railways, airports, seaports, and inland waterways are needed for the movement of military personnel, equipment, and material. And these requirements and maps were updated in July 2019. The gap analysis between the military geographic network and the civilian trans-European transport network concluded that there is an overlap by 93%, so that's very high. And in addition, also the gap between the military and civilian standards is smaller, in fact, than we expected at the outset. In fact, the standards are relatively similar. So our conclusion is that the EU transport infrastructure allows for military mobility, but we need further investments and some areas to be addressed. And we will then, of course, also evaluate where we can do that. We have looked also at cybersecurity for dual use requirements. And we have been looking at where we can have co-funding infrastructure projects with relevant vulnerable cybersecurity assets. We also evaluate the inclusion of certain dual use infrastructure requirements as revised Trans-European Transport Network Regulation is foreseen for June 2021. So we would also have a look at that revision ongoing. As you said, Fiona, the EU institutions are currently negotiating the budget for the next 7 years. And the envelope proposed by the Commission is a modest 1.7 billion, which is perhaps below what was expected at the outset, but it's a first significant and useful step. And it will allow us to have actions ongoing for military mobility in the infrastructure context. But also the second pillar, which is the regulatory and procedural one, is quite important. And I can give a few examples very briefly here. For instance, that the member states are committed to grant cross-border movement permissions within 5 working days, to simplify and streamline the customs procedures, to have harmonized rules on the transport of dangerous military goods, and to reduce the administrative burden. So I think that these are important examples of what can be done in the action plan. To conclude briefly, Fiona, we think that military mobility will enhance the EU's deterrence against outside threats. We think that it will enable the member states to act faster in line with defense needs, including in the NATO framework. It's only when we cooperate in developing the EU military mobility flagship project that we can have the member states having a whole of government approach and tackle our joint challenges to reinforce our common strength. Cooperation with NATO is a major feature in the implementation of this action plan. Military mobility is a good example of the fruitful cooperation between EU and NATO. We are reinforcing each other's efforts. Our cooperation has produced already now tangible results. And also, for example, by achieving coherence between the military requirements of EU and NATO. That can only have positive effects, of course, on our shared readiness and what we can do also in terms of co-funding. So we think that this flagship initiative is strengthening the EU pillar also within NATO, and a continued exchange of information between NATO and the EU is necessary in that respect. Jointly agreeing on what needs to be achieved to preserve peace and security. So I thank you, and I thank James also for his kicking this off and compliment here fully what he said on this particular flagship. Thank you, and back to you, Fiona.
Thank you very much, Harold. Kathleen, from the perspective of the expert community who've been looking at this for some period of time, clearly there's a lot going on between NATO and the EU in terms of cooperation and also pooling of resources. But there are, of course, some vulnerabilities in this dual use infrastructure. And I know that you've been working, very closely on this. There are the two aspects. Obviously, there's the physical critical infrastructure, all the nodal points we've been talking about, airports, ports themselves for shipping. There as the raid and roll networks, and obviously the upgrading of bridges for the heavy transportation. And then there's also the critical infrastructure for communications for the flows of data and information, both for the private sector commercial use, public use, and also for military use. And as both James and Herald have discussed, a lot of this is now in private hands. And we're also concerned about foreign ownership. I mean, China has obviously been at the forefront of a lot of our discussions with Chinese companies taking over the control of some of the European port infrastructure. We have the whole debates about 5G, and we now have increasing concerns about resilience. And I just wonder if you can sketch out for us some of the things that we should be concerned about. And then I'd like to turn over to Michael, to give us some of the perspective, some of the specific concerns that the Pentagon and the US government have been focused on. So Kathleen, I know this is a lot to cover, but I know that you've been thinking about this in great depth. And thank you for joining us today.
Well, thank you for having me, Fiona. I think what I would say most importantly is this conversation that we just heard between Herald and James, and then even the preceding session, really do highlight that military mobility is an area where the EU and NATO are overcoming some historical cultural barriers, some mutual suspicions, and are complementing, I think is the key word that you've heard repeatedly, are starting to see where they can come at an issue not in less of a competitive manner, but more in a manner of seeing how they intersect. And so many of the issues you just raised, whether directly related to mobility, which I think has been well covered, or related to a multitude of other types of challenges and threats that we're seeing, most of which are captured under a common understanding of what hybrid threats are. Those will require that same complementary approaches. So mobility demonstrates promise in these areas. It shows you that NATO can work at the higher end on the military requirement side, has specific knowledge on planning and logistics flows, can set requirements in some cases. That will get harder in many of these other areas where NATO doesn't have, where it's not so clearly a military knowledge set, and NATO doesn't perhaps have all the expertise. So in areas like cyber, where NATO is quite strong, or space, where we have concerns around a lot of commercial space architecture, certainly the military has a lot to bring to bear via NATO. But there are other areas like political and economic coercion, 5G, as you've mentioned, where the EU is going to be incredibly important. The things that will stand in the way are differences of viewpoint, again, culturally, around what the requirements are, who owns the requirements, what the classification needs to be around them. And also what is in the realm of government versus private sector. And then, of course, I think the other piece that I would highlight a little more than has come up already is the national level decision making. So, of course, NATO, EU, but then you also have that most of these resiliency requirements reside first and foremost at the national level. Both EU literature and NATO literature are very clear about that, but sometimes it gets lost in these conversations around NATO, EU cooperation in these areas. And in each of those national situations, there's different perceptions of threat, thus requirement. So for instance, around Chinese infrastructure investments, or around Russian ownership of various pieces of what many might consider critical infrastructure, or the elements of democracy. So in these kinds of areas, information, sensing, detection, attribution, this is where I think NATO can bring a lot, but it really has to have that private sector and the civil sector, that the latter piece of which the EU can really bring. You have to be able to work at these domestic international intersections at the same time. So making sure that you have the broadest swath of buy-in at the national level. I think the EU, frankly, helps with some countries, and NATO helps in the case of the US and the UK as an example, or Norway. It helps in other countries to have that hook. So that's good. It's the biggest possible tent for the hardest possible problem sets. And I also think in the EU, you have rules on economic, you have the ability to sanction. You have the, as referenced already by Herald, And by James, you have that ability to set regulation that can really help in many of these areas that are more in the civil sector, whether it's government, civil, or commercial sector. So what I see from this mobility conversation, just to wrap that thought up, is it's many of the same challenges that we're seeing played out, but mobility is actually perhaps giving us a leg up on NATO-EU cooperation by demonstrating that we can overcome some of these areas. Admittedly, mobility a little easier to work on because the military requirements piece is easier to establish. But I think it gives some hope for what's a really challenging issue set, as you've just named, around Russian and Chinese, among other efforts to undermine from within the countries of Europe.
Thank you, Kathleen. Michael, you have, in your very long career in the security field, worked on many of these issues prior to your current assignment. And I know you've been giving it a lot of thought. You have deep experience both in Europe and at the NATO level. And I wonder if, in listening to James and Herald, and then all of the issues that Kathleen has laid out, if you could give us some specific pointers about concerns that either keep you up at night, or that you feel that we should be paying particular attention to, both on the supply side and on this side about critical infrastructure. Obviously, 5G has been quite contentious. It's shown at the national level different risk tolerances. Particularly the US has had a much lower risk tolerance, it seems, than some of our NATO allies or some of our European colleagues. That's just one example. But I'm sure that you can point to others that we and those listening should be paying careful attention to. So thank you, Michael, also for joining us today.
Well, thank you, Fiona. And I do have to say at the outset that most of what I know about NATO, I learned from James Appathurai. And I learned a great deal from Kath Hicks' long years of government service in the Pentagon. So thank you both for that. And I look forward to getting to know Herald better. So as you know, the context that we operate at this moment in the Pentagon, the document that shapes our understanding of the context is National Defense Strategy. Secretary Esper has been very adamant that we effectively implement that strategy. And so the bounding concept in that strategy is great power competition. So when we look at the transatlantic security and defense community, we look very much, as the Deputy Secretary General said in the previous panel, at a more modern global transatlantic strategic culture. And within that culture, as we look at our competitors who also operate globally, we have to think about the approach of North America and Europe working together, because together we can deal effectively with China and or Russia, and both of them together. And so therefore, the real center of gravity is our transatlantic unity and our unity at NATO. And that unity is best expressed by the strength of consensus. So the ability to achieve consensus rapidly, to make rapid decisions, is absolutely essential to anything that we would do. And as James pointed out earlier, the mission of NATO is so effective on behalf of all the countries who are not members of NATO as well, that everyone is encouraged to work together, particularly in the current environment. At the leaders' meeting in London, heads of state and government in their declaration reiterated that NATO is the indispensable forum for transatlantic consultations on security and defense. And so those consultations, which drive decisions in all these specific areas, are absolutely critical to bringing Washington together with all allies and partners in EU member states who are not members of NATO to move in a direction that's effective, so that we can defend consensus, we can sustain deterrence, and we can be prepared to act in our own defense when necessary. The pandemic has highlighted a whole range of security issues that before didn't make it into the discussions, didn't make it to the table for decision. And so those are areas in answering your question that I'd like to highlight, but I wanted to provide this little bit of context first. NATO, being responsible predominantly for hard security for the transatlantic alliance or the transatlantic community, has a clear role in identifying the security vulnerabilities that will undermine our prosperity and our way of life, But as was pointed out, NATO doesn't have all the tools, nor does NATO need to have all the tools. But again, as the forum for transatlantic consultation, it's a great place to have these debates about what is in our security. In other words, what would prevent us from achieving consensus? So coercion and subversion of allies through hybrid attacks. And what would split our unity? And so nations bringing bilateral issues into the alliance begins to undermine our unity, but the Deputy Secretary General addressed that very effectively, I thought, in his comments in the previous panel. So in this context of security, the types of things that we think as a transatlantic security and defense community we need to focus on, and therefore what we need to discuss within NATO, are first and foremost the disinformation campaign that was conducted during the pandemic, which was just an acceleration of a disinformation campaign that was ongoing, and how both the Chinese and the Russians were very active using medical diplomacy, amongst other things, to try to sway our populations away from commitments to security, from commitments to the alliance, from commitments to transatlantic cooperation. And so that's an area of increasing NATO-EU collaboration, and I think a very successful one. Scrutinizing foreign direct investment, particularly from authoritarian regimes that don't share our values, is incredibly important. All the speakers mentioned the importance of critical infrastructure, the ownership of that critical infrastructure. The availability of that critical infrastructure in a crisis very much depends on its ownership. Because as James pointed out, the government's ability to take control of that infrastructure in a crisis is much diminished from what it was 30 years ago. So that's an incredibly important aspect that is a security issue highlighted by the alliance, but one that is clearly the responsibility of the European Union and the member states working in tandem with non-EU NATO allies across the Atlantic. We also learned that we're dependent on supply chains from sources that are not reliable, and also sources that could be used to try to influence our behaviors in a crisis, particularly when that crisis involves the source of those supplies. And so when we put together disinformation, foreign direct investment, which is a critical infrastructure issue, supply chain dependencies, these are just new issues that have come out of the pandemic that are clearly security issues that clearly require closer and more deep and strong NATO-EU relationships and NATO-EU consultations. Those are very much on our mind in the Pentagon. And I just finish up by saying I've been these into 4 areas, and they all come back to the ability of NATO to achieve consensus rapidly and to operate at the speed of relevance. The first is resilience. All these issues I identified allow our societies to continue to operate while under attack. That's a definition of resilience that some people use. So all of these areas get at our ability for governments to join consensus, and therefore our assets and capabilities to maneuver to increase our deterrence, but to assure our defense. The second one is readiness. And when we think about resilience and readiness, we need to think not just military readiness or resilience, but political and diplomatic resilience at the strategic level, as well as military resilience and readiness at the operational level. We also need to think about economic resilience and economic readiness, because all of those contribute to our ability to sustain consensus, and very much information readiness and information resilience, so that we have a narrative that builds trust in our societies, because that trust enables action. And then responsiveness. Yes, we can operate. Yes, we're ready to operate, but can we respond quickly? Can we move at the speed of relevance? Can we achieve those decisions? And in that, we really have to remain focused on the hybrid activities of our adversaries, and which includes the cyber activities as well, because those are aimed at winning without fighting on their side. They're aimed at us not achieving consensus. They're aimed at us not being able to take decisions, to move forces, to continue with deterrence, and to conduct defense if necessary. And so the fourth one that I'd like to bring into the discussion, and here I'll finish, is on reinforcement. The Deputy Secretary General was asked about the Defender 20 exercise. I would like just to add to his comments that the strength of the Defender 20 exercise was in planning and executing the movement of forces from the United States to Europe, and to ensuring the receiving critical infrastructure was capable of receiving those forces, and then those forces could move across Europe to their exercise positions. All of that was done. That was highly successful was not very much impacted by the pandemic. It was just the very visible field training portion that had to be curtailed. And so that was a clear demonstration of an ability to reinforce in a very resilient environment that demonstrated the high readiness forces that were prepared to do that, and that required us to take decisions to enable that to happen. And so it was very responsive as well. So with all of that, these specific areas that I mentioned, disinformation, foreign direct investment, supply chain dependencies, and critical infrastructure, enable the alliance to do what the alliance needs to do, working together with the European Union. So the transatlantic community then is focused on deterrence and defense, and it's not left to any one nation or any group of nations, but it's a collective endeavor that's important to all of us.
This is great, Michael. Thank you very much. And I find your 4 Rs an extremely useful frame: resilience, readiness, responsiveness, and reinforcement. That's very helpful as we go along and think about this. We've had a couple of questions that I've been looking at in the chat as we've been going along, and I'll try to weave them in, now as we follow up on all of your opening comments here. One of the questions has come from David Getsadze of Georgia about the Black Sea region. And I think that this, fits in well with some of the comments from Deputy Secretary General, who's obviously from Romania, a key part of the Black Sea region. He's asking a number of questions about the NATO engagement in the Black Sea Basin, but also the 3 Seas initiative, which was something, obviously, Michael, that the United States has been interested in. We'd have a number of senior US officials attending, including President Trump for one of the inaugural meetings in Poland, some of the Black Sea sessions. And part of the Black Sea dialogue and the 3 Seas discussions have been about infrastructure, about how to improve a lot of the communications, not just on a north-south access, but also an east-west access across Europe. Because, one of the artifacts of the Cold War, of course, has been of infrastructure patterns that were linked into different systems. And we still see a great deal of vulnerability in regions like the Western Balkans or the Black Sea Basin, because of the critical infrastructure is just not there, connecting them to many of their neighbours, or even to some of the major players within Europe. And we've been trying to find ways of addressing this in different ways. This has obviously been some of the vulnerabilities that we've been most concerned about the foreign direct investment that you've raised, Michael, coming in from China or from Russia or from other players who are not part of this transatlantic institutional arrangements. And when we start to think about some of the issues that you've raised about resilience, readiness, responsiveness, and then reinforcement, it does emphasize that we're only as strong as some of our weakest links. And obviously parts of the Western Balkans that have fallen between the cracks of both the EU and NATO, and some of the regional players in the Black Sea Basin, we can see where those vulnerabilities are. And I wonder, Michael, if you have any thoughts there in response to the question of David about how NATO or the US, he hasn't really mentioned the EU, but other players can be more involved in this region, and how we might think about dealing, certainly from the US perspective. And then I'll ask our colleagues to come in with some of those vulnerabilities in these critical regions that have fallen into the cracks.
Thank you, Fiona. It's a great question. I was just writing to the team this morning, and the Black Sea strategy was uppermost as one of our priorities for all the reasons that we know. In that regard, I think there's a lot going on in the Black Sea region. I know James has been personally very involved, as have others. There's very much European Union going on in the Black Sea region, but the focus has been elsewhere, quite rightly, on the nearest term and perhaps the most catastrophic scenario, which would involve the Baltics in the north and east. But NATO has, for example, a tailored forward presence, and there's air policing in the region as well. There's a lot of bilateral activities of the United States, but there's also bilateral activities of other nations and multilateral activities going on in the region. And again, they haven't really had the focus that other regions have had, but I think that is changing with the incredible progress that both Romania and Bulgaria have had, for example, not only in the development of their military capabilities, but in their deeper integration into NATO, into the NATO exercises, but also into the European Union. There's also, I think, given the relationship currently between NATO ally Turkey and their geographic neighbor Russia, and how that's playing out in Syria and the broader Mediterranean, has brought more focus onto the Black Sea as well, particularly as NATO retains a presence, a maritime presence in the Black Sea, and Turkey, of course, administers the Montreux Convention, which is an important dialogue to maintain the NATO presence, but also to adhere to the Montreux Convention, gives Turkey a role. So there's an increasing importance, particularly in the Caucasus, with Georgia's fantastic development and great contributions to Afghanistan, for example, that connection across the Black Sea needs to be reinforced, and we need to be more holistic in our view. The biggest challenge that we face, and I'll finish here, is that the Black Sea and the Mediterranean tend to be folds on everybody's maps. One organization will have half of the Black Sea, another organization with whom they rarely interact will have the other half of the Black Sea. Same thing with the North-South. And so we don't get that conversation together. And so here in Washington, under the National Security Council and with the State Department, we've really been focusing on working those seam issues that we call them, those folds in the map, so that all the right people on both sides are making the necessary connections so that we can amplify the good work that nations have been doing and that NATO and the EU have been doing. So we can bring that into a more coherent and a more well-structured piece of the overall NATO 360 approach, particularly under the deterrence and defense concept.
That's a great point, Michael. I like the image of the maps and getting lost in the folds and the seams, but in the cracks. We need to open those out and take a different look. I mean, Kathleen, I'll turn to you now and maybe ask you, you know, and a variant in this question as well. I mean, obviously the Western Balkans is on the same map, you know, when picking up Michael's point there, but we still have, you know, parts of the Western Balkans by virtue of, you know, the legacy of the conflicts, of the collapse of the state of Yugoslavia, you know, ongoing tensions, and, you know, questions about, you know, reform and some of the other issues that we're concerned about there that have not become part of the transatlantic institutional arrangements or part of the broader European political arrangements. So we have a lot to deal with there. And obviously, you know, these are areas where we've seen, you know, Russian and Chinese involvement, and especially playing on some of these issues that Michael was concerned about, the hybrid threats, the disinformation. And again, this is also another kind of weakness in this setup. And I wonder if you could use that, Kathleen, as a jumping off point, you know, on some of these issues too.
Well, let me first say I'm not an expert on the Western Balkans, but just to pick up where Michael raised a few points, even just recently, we've seen both China and Russia use medical diplomacy, probably not very successful medical diplomacy, but attempt to use medical diplomacy in the context of COVID. And that's just building on other areas where there are efforts by both parties to try to undermine the EU, or in some cases, NATO's engagement in the region. And it's a real concern for the alliance. I mean, I think, you know, as you stated in the, I think the run up to this question, before Michael, there has been, of course, a lot of focus on the Baltic states appropriately. There's a lot of reasons for why NATO in particular should be very concerned about the security of the Baltics. But the Balkans provide a different door into area of concern into NATO's into NATO's region, and certainly for the EU. And what I would say, going back to what I've already said, really, is in some cases, NATO or countries bilaterally, as Michael said, that are NATO members may be the ideal conduits for successfully carrying forward the message about what the concerns are and how to counter them. In some cases, it will be the EU or EU member states that may be not NATO member states. But the key here is understanding that it's going to require in these areas like 5G infrastructure, like physical infrastructure, like cyber, like disinformation, media ownership, democratic processes, elections, et cetera, political party funds, you know, economic coercion and political coercion possibilities. This requires a multifaceted approach. And in some cases, NATO will be able to fit into that with regard to its activities, partner activities. In some cases, the EU is well situated. And in many cases, honestly, a lot of this is domestic, and it's going to take some pressure points that are more on the private sector side and on the EU member state side.
That's great, Kathleen. I mean, obviously, this is pretty challenging. That actually leads quite well into another question that we've had here in the chat. So I have to keep putting my glasses on. I can see at one level and then not at the other. Very small print, these chats. We've had a question from Tanya Latici from the European Parliament, who is asking about EU's Article 42.7 on mutual defence, the mutual defence clause. And wondering about ongoing reflections in both NATO and the EU about this clause, and whether there is a division of a mutual defence division of labour that's possible. I mean, Kathleen, you'd picked up on some of these issues here. I mean, the national dimension of this, but I think I'll turn this over to Harold and then go to James as well. Because obviously, Harold, you could give us a bit of thinking about this mutual defence clause and some of this ideas of division of labour. And James, in an earlier chat that we had in preparation for this panel, we'd flagged some of the concerns about division of labour and duplication in the sense of resilience. You know, Michael pointed out some of the concerns from the Pentagon's point of view of, weaknesses in supply chains that the pandemic has revealed. And previously, some of these questions about divisions of labour assumed that we were in some kind of steady state where supplies would not be at risk, or there wouldn't be some risks of ruptures. And clearly, actually, duplication of effort may, in fact, be necessary now in this new environment. But Harold, perhaps you could give us some more insight into thinking about the mutual defence clause and where this stands from your perspective right now as you're thinking about this 1.7 billion budget and some of this division of labour, whether that's been factored into that thinking. And then I'll move to James with some of the other aspects of this question. Thank you again, Kathleen, for your contributions there.
Thank you, Fiona, and thank you for the question. In fact, of course, the cooperation between the EU and NATO is long-standing and well defined in agreement between the two on a number of areas where we are active. Military mobility is one of them, but of course it ranges much broader. Allow me to come briefly back on Western Balkans with the mentioning of the Transport Community Treaty that we concluded lately, and where we will be able to step up our activity also with this field, and that we can extend also to the Western Balkans, not leaving that gap over there. There is now a secretariat installed in Belgrade, and we hope that we can expand on it also to make sure that we have a good implementation of the regulation that is there since last year, the 452 on screening of foreign direct investments, and that's crucially important. And it's really important that Western Balkans are included into the picture through this TCT that was signed under the last Commission. With regard to the division of labor, I think that I mean, for the fields that I'm directly responsible for, what we are looking after is a whole of government approach, so that there is a very good cooperation between all of the partners, whether they are the External Action Service and or lead Mr. Borrell, of course, spoke this morning and was very clear in his engagement in the cooperation with NATO. But also, of course, with the EU military services, and there also we link directly to the PESCO exercise that is ongoing, and so this is a quite complex construct where we make sure that we have all partners around the table, and I think that is the key to success. That we are sure that we have and member states and NATO and EU and all the different services who are all united in the actions ongoing. So in the division of labor, I don't know whether that is a good expression. I would rather, from the experience that I have now over the past 2 years in working on the action plan, call it a unison in labor, and making sure that we don't go on the wrong track, and that we do things in very, very straight cooperation between NATO and EU, and that there are the necessary links with the US, and that we can deliver on concrete areas of work, and that is what I'm very dedicated to be doing. And I think military mobility, therefore, through this whole of government approach, can be successful. So it's not a direct reply. I'm sorry, Fiona. I rather give let's say a reply that points at where I think we need to be successful. And the money that you refer to, the 1.7, should be dealt with also in an equal way. If this money is approved end of next week, the 1.7 billion, the budget is not enormous. So we need to target that very, very carefully so that it serves the purpose. It serves this dual use between exactly where we need to land. So also the Defender exercise brought us some further lessons on what we can do on capacity for reception in ports and airports, on throughput via rail and road, and on staging where it finally lands. And finding a close unison between the different areas, between the civilian and the military, is for primary concern for us and for me here, in order to have a swift rollout. If we can demonstrate a swift rollout in a whole of government approach, I'm confident that we can do much, much more afterwards. So with that, let's say, clear remark, I would like to give back to you or to James. Thank you, Fiona.
No, that's great, Harold, because it actually links in now to a question that we're getting in, and I'll bring that to you first and then to James, from Erwan Lagadek from GW, George Washington University, who's asking whether, given what Michael Ryan said about the speed of relevance, that we need here, whether the time frame for the MFF and for the funding on military mobility issues is restrictive. Is it framing things in such a way that we can't respond quickly, given it's sort of the 7-year time frame and the difficulties in obviously negotiating all of this. Is it sufficient to allow us to be relevant and to be flexible and to be able to respond to issues as they come up? I mean, you've touched on that just yourself here. Obviously it's difficult from your perspective because you're deeply involved in these negotiations. We know how complex they are and how much time they take. But do you think that we have enough flexibility in there to be able to deal with all the issues as they arise?
The answer is yes. I mean, we are, of course, not sitting still. We are very active in our cooperation with NATO on what is needed, very active in our cooperation with the member states as well to identify whether the military requirements can be, let's say, overlaid with the civilian ones and whether the maps are congruent or not. I indicated to you that for the maps, for instance, we have 93% of congruency, and also for the military requirements, it's the same. And so we are already preparing what could be a future project pipeline. And as soon as these discussions will be concluded, and which I expect to be swiftly, we will not, let's say, wait and sit. In fact, we would then adopt an implementing and a delegated act, both of them, until the end of the year. And the calls for proposals for projects could already come out at the beginning of 2021. In fact, Fiona, there is quite a bit of work that we could start relatively swiftly in this approach of cooperation, which will lead to rollout of projects in ports and airports along rail and along road. It is not building upon, I would say, a pipeline that has to be started. There is a tradition of implementation of such projects. What we needed and what was not done so far is that we took the military requirements into account and that we had the reflection and the cleverness of merging these two. So I expect win-win situations, and even if a budget would not be there, then I still expect a win-win situation from the action plan and from the work that we have been doing, because we will try to integrate that also into our regulatory where we can, so that we are more responsive and that we can do more things in the longer future. So the answer again to this question is yes, there is a sufficient robust cooperation already now. And that's also an answer to the previous question. And I expect the MFF not to be a hindrance to it, because the pipeline of projects is robust enough to consume the money as of 21.
That's great, Harold. Thanks. I'm going to come to James now. And actually, everyone's asked another question, which actually picks up directly on what you're saying here. You'll all be pleased to know that people are paying attention. So they're responding to things that you're saying. I think that this is a testament to the richness of the discussion here and everyone's excellent perspectives. Everyone's also wondering that, given actually, Harold, what you're just saying here now, that mobility is of broader benefit and have a lot of flexibility built in, but you're also trying to sell military mobility as part of larger packages for bringing European infrastructure together. He's actually wondering whether there are costs to having a broader framing of the issue like this, and whether we should actually, and this is really kind of more in the NATO frame here, James, be much more candid in prioritizing mobility to the east for, the reinforcement of the Baltics and Poland. Now, obviously, that's of great concern to the Baltic states and to Poland, but as I've been trying to kind of bring out in this discussion, we also have to be concerned about the Western Balkans, the Black Sea basin, and we've been talking about, as Harold's been saying, unity of effort here and looking at Europe as a whole and not trying to focus on just individual parts of the map. So, James, how would you, from the NATO perspective, respond, to that idea about whether we should be much more candid and absolutely prioritizing mobility to the east, specifically to the Baltics and to Poland?
Good question. And of course, we think about these things. I'll be very clear. From a NATO point of view, our Supreme Allied Commander, our top general, is responsible for a certain area of operations. And our first priority is to make sure that he can move, it's been him so far, can move troops and all necessary equipment where he needs to, up to every inch and millimeter of NATO territory. That includes the Baltic states and Poland and all of the East. That is our first priority. And we are pretty confident that we can. We need to improve some things, and we've put forces out there to make sure that our commitment to those areas is clear and to act as a deterrent. But then you're quite right. We know perfectly well that NATO's security can't be guaranteed by only securing our borders. We have to project stability. NATO is safer when our neighborhood is more safe, and that includes the Baltic Sea region. Sweden and Finland are very much caught up in what happens up there. So we work very closely with them. In the Black Sea, as everybody knows, after annexing Crimea, Russia has moved in a huge amount of high-end military capability, which they are then now using to project force, to project violence into Syria. They're using it to get around into the southern Mediterranean. That affects our allies. It affects our very close partners, Georgia and Ukraine. So we're working very closely with them as well. But it's not the same. We don't have, of course, an Article 5 commitment to these countries. What we're doing our best to ensure that they are highly interoperable with us. And that can include, of course, their ability to receive forces. So they're not necessarily part of NATO Article 5 exercises, but once a year we have an exercise with Georgia, and NATO forces go there and exercise there, and so does the US, et cetera. So I think actually we're, with a sort of tiered effect, we are making sure that we can both protect our members and contribute to security beyond our borders. I did want to answer one of the issues that you raised, and that's this question of division of labor. And I think it's a really hard one, and it's a complicated one. I think when it comes to Article 5 on the NATO side and 42.7 on the EU side, frankly, I'm not that concerned. Article 5 within NATO is very clear, and that is an attack on one is an attack on all. We know what it would look like. We know how to respond. The EU is frankly developing what 42.7 would look like, and I don't want to speak for them, but I think that there's complementarity there, and we don't really see too much competition. What does have to be clear, though, is what each represents, because we couldn't have a situation where one NATO country that's also in the EU doesn't know which way to go in the moment of crisis. That has to be clear. So there has to be clarity. But I think another important point is raised by many people, but in particular by Michael, who always says nice things about other people and then shows he's the smartest guy in the room, but it's a graceful way of doing it first. We sometimes hear from countries that are in the EU and in NATO, well, we're doing it in the EU, so we don't need to duplicate it by doing it in NATO. But when it comes to resilience in particular, and that has been really made very clear by COVID, and you mentioned, for example, stockpiling. Yes, there are 22 members in both, but that's not all. And actually, there's big ones who aren't in both. So in fact, 58% of the population of NATO is not in the EU. That's about 582 million people. So it isn't enough to say it's being done in the EU, so we don't need to do it in NATO. 582 million NATO citizens are not going to benefit from that. So sometimes there will need to be duplication. We need to work out how to do that so countries that are in the EU aren't paying twice. That doesn't make sense for them either. But we cannot get into a political situation where the non-EU NATO members feel like their security is not being provided for because the EU is providing for security for EU members, and that's where it stops. So we'll have to have some very complicated political discussions. We can overcome it, but I think that's an evolution in the way we've seen the way the two organizations work together that we need to now face up to.
That's excellent, James. We have another question coming in from Seth Johnson about recent developments in military and civilian intelligence cooperation, which I think actually fits into many of the issues that we've discussed here. I mean, you emphasized, James, the need here for looking at the global picture. And obviously intelligence cooperation is a major part of that, of trying to get a full assessment of all of the threats that are facing NATO member states, as well as obviously those that are part of the EU. Now, there are obviously some challenges with this. We already touched upon the infrastructure, communications and data aspects of this with 5G and some of the debates that we've had there about security of communications, which is an important part. But how do you see, and I'll then go to Michael and Kathleen on this as well, both the state of current military and civilian intelligence cooperation and some of the future trends that we need to be mindful of?
So this is obviously a huge question. We have come light years ahead in NATO from where we were. So we've stood up an intelligence division. We know how to fuse intelligence now. And I think countries in NATO have much more confidence that NATO knows how to do it, and they are providing more and more of it. So the quality has gone up substantially. And so we're very, very satisfied with that. It's really much, much better. But I think the key point is what you have just raised, and that is our confidence in the infrastructure that we are using. And that will become very much at risk. I can mention, for example, quantum encryption or quantum decryption of classified intelligence. Once a country cracks that, then it will be impossible to crack their intelligence and very easy for them to crack ours. If we become overly reliant on or dependent on components from companies which we can't trust, then, and I'm not naming anyone in particular, but we all know exactly what the issues are out on the table. This can compromise our confidence in each other and our ability to share information. So again, we come back to resilience. Again, we come back to standards being set. Again, we come back to the kind of transatlantic cooperation that Michael was talking about. But I'd like to just conclude on that by having the same feeling of encouragement that Herald offered. Some people talk about bureaucracies being slow, and then we have rivalries. And yeah, sometimes we're slow and sometimes we have rivalries. But you see how fast the EU is moving on this. You see how well NATO and the EU are working on this. So actually, I'm pretty confident that military mobility actually gives us an example of how we can actually get on with it when we have enough funding, political direction, and a clear mission.
Thanks, James. I can see that Darb has appeared on screen, which probably means our time is almost up. But I did want to ask, Michael and Kathleen, if they had any comments on that particular critical issue before we hand over to the next panel. Michael.
Yes, thank you, Fiona. Very quickly, I agree with everything James Appathurai said. I only had one exception, but I thank him for the compliment anyway. In the context of mutual defense, we have to think about political defense, economic defense, information defense. And there, the EU, as James said, is moving very quickly and has a great deal to add. So on the concept of intelligence sharing, we also need to think about law enforcement intelligence, because most of what our competitors and adversaries are doing in Europe to undermine our resilience and undermine our political cohesion is in the law enforcement realm. And so military intelligence generally comes from the outside into the alliance, looks at threats beyond our borders. But what's going on inside the alliance, again, is a law enforcement issue. Law enforcement deals with those issues, and we need to find a way to merge that military intelligence and that law enforcement intelligence so that working between NATO and EU, we get all of our tools moving in the right direction to deal with those adversaries. Thank you.
That's an excellent point, Michael. Thank you. And Kathleen?
I would just build on that. I think Michael and James have said it very well. And the add-on I would put on there once again is the private sector. So yes to the military intelligence, yes to the law enforcement side, but a huge amount of these challenges are coming at private sector entities or civil society, for instance, NGOs and others. And that's about information sharing. It's about open source, that piece of it. And it's about trust and confidence between those entities, whether it's countries' governments and their people and their industries and their civil societies, or it's between NATO and those societies or EU. And that's where places like the Hybrid Center of Excellence and others that are trying to bridge these gaps between civil society and government are so vital.
Thank you so much. There was one last question that came in about the Arctic, which I just want to apologize to the person who asked the question that unfortunately the Arctic has just proven to be a sea too far for us to tackle in the time frame that we have. But thank you everybody for these fantastic comments. As you can see from all the questions, we had a really engaged audience, and it's just been a privilege and honor to be with you today. And DARBHLA, over to you, and thank you so much to the EU delegation for working with us at Brookings on this very important series of events. And again, thank you to everyone.